Today, I want to talk about the grade on Zwift and whether it's actually a reasonable option for an FTP test. Zwift's fancy new idea to revolutionise FTP testing was to introduce a climb they call the grade, which calculates your FTP based on your average power output up the climb. And the idea behind this was to try and sort of break down the barrier to the horrible, painful, and often difficult to execute 20-minute test, which a lot of people, especially beginners, find really difficult. And I think the grade has some really good merits to it, as we're going to discuss later in the video. But I also think it has one really major flaw. But in order to discuss it properly, I'm going to have to give the grade a go myself, do an all-out effort and see just how much it thinks my FTP is. I'm using myself as an example here because I've been training pretty consistently across the past few years. So I've got a lot of data and a really good idea of what my various different training and performance zones are. And I have a generally pretty good picture of what sort of power I can sustain for different durations. Last season, my power peaked at about 330 watts or 5 watts per kilo for that sort of 1 hour FTP effort. And after a bit of a messy autumn and late summer where my training volume dipped quite significantly, I've been slowly building back up to the point now where the past few months have been really consistent and I've got some very good training done. The grade is especially interesting to me because of my background in racing. I've come from a background of racing hill climbs, and if any of you have ever raced a hill climb before, you'll know going all out as hard as you can to get up to the top of a climb is the best way to get the absolute maximum performance out of your legs. So that's ideal for an FTP test, isn't it? You want people to get as much performance out on the table as possible, so having the carrot on the stick at the top of a climb to chase really will help motivate people to push every last watt they can. Unlike a 20-minute test where you're just watching a timer tick down. But inherently, that amazing advantage of having a climb introduces this major drawback that I'm really concerned about with this method of testing. A big bit of context is going to be quite important to the narrative of the video here is my current training. Now, as it's winter, if you have a look at my Strava, you'll see over the past couple of months, I've pretty much exclusively been doing zone 2 and a little bit of zone 3 work with barely anything above that intensity, with the goal of creating a really big endurance base before sharpening up later in the season. Which means my VO2 max peak is probably going to be a little bit closer to my threshold than it would be later in the season when I'm working on that a lot. So hold on to that thought because I think it's going to become relevant later on. I'm going into this test, which you're about to see, with a pretty clear expectation of where my fitness is. I know quite comfortably I should be able to do sort of 320 to 330 watts for an hour. If you ask me to jump on the turbo right now and do a 1 hour threshold effort, along with probably telling you where to go, I think, yeah, 320 to 330 watts is probably what I'll be able to just about put out. And roughly for the sort of 12 minutes we're looking at today, I think 350 watts is about my peak. I don't expect it to be too much higher than that. I might be able to push 360, but I'm just not sure about how them higher intensities are looking at the minute for my legs. But I guess there's only one way to find out. Right, it's time for me to throw my kit on and get suffering up the grade. Right, this is going to be a tough one. It's going to be real painful, but here we go. Settling into the climb then, my legs actually started feeling really good from the off. My power was a little bit fluctuating, but I decided to be strict with myself and stick at that 355 to 360 kind of target. You'll see in this first little split, I was a bit all over the place, just trying to settle into the rhythm, trying to get into the right gearing. But as soon as the gradient started to get consistent, I started to feel at home at that sort of 350 watt mark. And you'll see as I cross the first out of the 10 checkpoints, I've cracked an average power of 359 watts. Perfectly on target if you'd ask me. And that was a trend that continued, slowly tapping out the power whenever I got a bit too eager and spiked up to 170, reining it back in just that little bit, trying to keep on that 350 to 360 target. Okay, 2 out of 10. I do really like how the grade does give you these consistent checkpoints every 10th of the climb, and you even have a progress bar down the bottom. As you can see, I'm already hitting nearly 20% of the climb, and it's flying by, which is a really good motivator to keep me going, knowing it's actually not that far. You can see the little bit of blue on the mini-map coming into vision, which is the flat section about halfway up. I really don't know why Zwift added this, as if the goal of this climb was to be an FTP test, surely having a short flat section is going to just ruin everyone's rhythm. Fortunately, I was on quite a low trainer difficulty because I didn't want that affecting me. As you can see, my power was perfectly in range still, occasionally dropping just that little bit low, as I was in a bit of an awkward middle ground between two gears. In order to fix that, I do actually have the single speed Zwift cog and click setup on its way, courtesy of Zwift, that I'm really excited to try out over the next few weeks. As we roll into the flat section then, that's the end of the fourth split, and you can see my power's crept up that little bit to 362. I'd said to myself, after the halfway mark, which is around the flat section, I'm allowed to go a little bit more all out up the hairpins and just empty everything left in the tank. So, as you can see, I'm right at it, slowly cranking up the power up towards that sort of 370 watt mark. I knew exactly what I had to do, and my brain went into hill climb mission mode, absolutely leathering it up the section of this climb. Coming through the next split, I averaged 370 watts, so yeah, I'm really turning the screw now, and that was something that was only going to keep continuing. It was getting really painful though, and as my average power cracks 360, I am starting to suffer. You can see my heart rate's deep into the 190s now, so we really are having to push now. But I know there's only a couple of minutes left, and I'm watching that progress bar slowly tick up around 80% now, 368 for the 8th segment, and this is where it gets crazy. I start going well up into the 370, 380 watt mark, and really turning that gear, even touching to 390 at times, determined to get the highest average I possibly could. And obviously my heart rate starts creeping up with it. So I am just laser focused on the top, going all out. Finishing sector 9, I've averaged 376 watts, the highest yet. And I know this is it, all or nothing for the last 350 meters, right onto the top of the climb. And as you can see, I am really suffering now, digging deep, trying to just hold on to the top, put out every last watt. Let's see if I can crack 400 for the last few hundred meters, and let's see what my time is. We clock the grade in 10 minutes 41 seconds 0.85, and if you look over to the right, you should be able to see that banner saying 316 watts. But I was so knackered that I completely missed it. I cannot believe I was so exhausted I managed to completely miss the FTP number at the top of the climb. But as you lot all saw, it gave me a number of 316 watts. As you probably can see from how much I was suffering, that was clearly well above threshold and actually was a 10-minute power PB for myself. Based on 20-minute tests in the past and on 1-hour performances, I've had an FTP up at around 330 watts. And I know back then, 365 would have been a real tall order, hence why this is my new 10-minute PB. But this is where context really matters. At 10 minutes 41 seconds, this was not a threshold effort for me, and it was very much a VO2 max dominant one with a very sizable anaerobic contribution. Trying to predict 60-minute threshold power from an 11-minute effort is always going to be fragile and introduce a lot of variability. People already criticise doing a 20-minute test as too inconsistent and too short to be able to accurately extrapolate that to predict 1-hour power, which, you know, at the end of the day, that is what FTP is supposed to represent. And if you take those 20-minute test criticisms and apply them to an even shorter, in my case, 11-minute test, it just amplifies those problems even more. Without a doubt, there is absolutely a correlation between your 10-minute power and your sort of theoretical FTP. However, that relationship is going to be very rider and training dependent. For some riders with a very high threshold but not much VO2 max conditioning, it might be only 5% above threshold. But for others, especially quite punchy riders, they might be able to produce 15 to 20% above their threshold power for just 10 minutes. And the shorter the FTP test you do, the wider that range is going to get. So backpedaling a little bit and talking about who I think this test is really aimed for. And I think it's predominantly aimed at beginners. Unless you're carrying a lot of fitness from a previous sporting background, as a beginner, the grade is probably going to take you in the region of 20 to 30 minutes. And at that sort of duration, it's quite a good analogy for a 20-minute test, with all the benefits I explained earlier of being potentially easier to execute. And thus, it'll probably work quite well when you extrapolate that to try and calculate 1 hour FTP. But the problem starts to come in as you get fitter, the goalposts are going to start to move. You know, the fitter you get and the faster you climb, the shorter the duration of the test. And the more and more and more the test skews towards more VO2 max dominant riders and away from the threshold diesel engine power that FTP is supposed to represent. And when you get to the level I'm at now, after years and years and years of training, the test is so short that it is definitely no longer a threshold effort. And if you look at riders even better than me, cracking sub 9-minute times, that for sure is a VO2 max effort. And that in a nutshell is why I am not a fan of a dynamic length test as a performance benchmark. A good performance benchmark should be consistent and repeatable and always have the same thing it's measuring. Now, as you get fitter, you might want to test other power zones. For example, my 10-minute power probably actually is super important for racing, but I should be testing that specifically around that duration. And yes, as I mentioned before, it will have a correlation to my longer duration, hour-long power. It's not directly linked. Again, as you get more advanced in your training and performance, you are going to be looking at these different zones separately and prioritizing depending on the nature of the events or races you're targeting. And there's actually kind of a practical risk there as well. If you start optimizing your training around improving your time up the grade, you are naturally going to start skewing more and more and more to short duration anaerobic or VO2 max efforts, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it might lead you to sort of neglect that whole threshold side of your performance profile, which again, for a beginner, they might not quite understand what they're doing there. You can get better at a climb like the grade without necessarily improving your long, steady state duration efforts, which isn't that what FTP is meant to represent? And of course, because of all of this, your rider type is going to massively play into your results. You know, maybe you specialize in 25-mile TTs that take sort of in that sort of hour ballpark to complete. Well, then it's probably going to underread for you, as riders like that typically have a very narrow gap between their threshold and sort of VO2 max or zone 5 power. Whereas if you are a punchy rider that maybe just races hill climbs or track, well, it could quite likely overread for you. And I think that's why Zwift, when they've calibrated this test, have been quite aggressive with how much they scale down your average power to predict an FTP. And from what I've seen, with Zwift assuming my 11-minute power was 115% of threshold, I think for most people, unless you are an absolute specialist at that duration, this test is more likely to underread than overread. But I don't want to be all doom and gloom about it. For most people, FTP doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, as long as you've got a clear idea of where your sort of zone ranges are, you're going to be fine for training. Now, don't wildly overestimate or wildly underestimate your FTP, but as long as you're within, you know, a few percent either way, you shouldn't have any problems finding your zone 2, finding your threshold efforts, finding your VO2 max efforts. The huge merit of this is that classic carrot on a stick factor that I think I really found out when I was doing my test, that actually I way overperformed compared to my expectations. And I think that's part of just being on a climb, knowing where the top is, and really pushing to get there as quick as you can. That's why in the real world, a lot of the time it's recommended to try and find a long 20-minute climb to do a 20-minute test, rather than trying to do it on a flat road, as there's something in your brain that just makes you want to give everything you can to get to the top of a climb. As I said before, I really like that Zwift has sort of gamified the FTP test by putting them every 10% splits on there and having that like ticking down progress bar showing you just how close you are to the top. Because, you know, when you get sort of 10, 15% in, you're like, wow, I've only just started, but I'm already at 15%. well, that's really motivating and really does help you push on harder and get every little bit of performance out. So to summarise all my thoughts, do I think the grade is something that should be thrown in the bin and forgotten about as an FTP test? Well, no. But do I think it's the perfect FTP test? Well, definitely not either. And I think it's quite a nuanced discussion. As I said before, for a complete beginner doing their first ever FTP test, I actually think it's far easier to execute than a standard 20-minute test. And it could even be better than a ramp test because we all know there's a ton of problems with ramp tests. However, if you are a very advanced rider with an FTP up above that sort of 300 watt mark, you've really got to take it with a pinch of salt. And I think honestly, the sort of riders where this test is going to be very skewed for probably aren't going to fall foul of these problems I've mentioned. So what do you think about the grade? You're going to have to let me know in the comments below. And actually, it's really interesting. Let me know what your average power was and what it predicted your FTP as. And if enough of you comment, maybe we'll get a bit of an idea about the sort of power curve that Zwift is putting riders on. As of course, because of the variable duration, it can't be just assuming everyone's power is 115% of threshold. And if you want to watch me suffer even more, at the weekend, I'm going out to give my BMC hill climb machine its first go up a climbing effort and going to smash it up Winnets Pass in the Peak District to see just how close to the KOM this ultralight bike will help me to get. So if you don't want to miss that and any upcoming Zwift and possibly Ruby content, get yourself subscribed down below, give this video a thumbs up, and I'll see you all in the next one.